The year was 1871, and the town of Ash Hollow crouched against the plains like a settlement carved by stubbornness more than promise. Wind drove grit through the main street, scattering scraps of paper and dust across the boards of shuttered storefronts. A single horse shifted near the hitching post outside the saloon, stamping its hoof in the dirt, the sound sharp in the otherwise empty silence. On the far side of the street, she stood alone. Her shawl, once cream, now carried the stain of long travel and harsh weather. Her hands clutched the fabric close to her shoulders, though the chill was not the only reason for her trembling. She felt the eyes. They clung to her as she walked slowly, as though every measured step would steady her breath, as though dignity could shield her from the whispers she knew were already stirring. Her name was Clara Reeves. Once she had been spoken of with admiration, daughter of a merchant back east, raised in a household where refinement was currency and a woman's reputation weighed more than gold. But admiration had soured. Betrayal had crept into her life like rot in timber. The details no longer mattered here, so far from the manicured avenues of her youth, yet they followed her like a curse. The world back east had turned its back, and the west, unyielding and merciless, had greeted her not with welcome, but with suspicion. Children were the first to voice what the grown men and women kept pressed behind their lips. A boy of perhaps 10 pointed with a crooked finger. "That's her," he said, the words sharp and loud, meant to carry. "Pa says she ain't fit to be trusted." His friends snickered, eyes bright with the cruel certainty of youth. Clara lifted her chin, her face pale, against the wind. She would not answer, not to children, but her silence only deepened the sting. She passed by the general store. Through the window, men leaned near barrels of grain, their voices hushed but glances quick and cutting. A woman stepped out from the doorway, skirts swishing, a basket crooked in her arm. She looked Clara up and down once, her gaze cold as steel, then turned deliberately aside. Clara's steps faltered but did not stop. She had learned long ago that retreat gave them victory. Still, her eyes sought one face among them all, a face she prayed would meet hers with something warmer than disdain. Her father stood near the blacksmith's forge, gray in beard and hair, his shoulders as square as ever, though his eyes held the exhaustion of a man too long at war with his own kin. For a heartbeat, she thought he might move to her, might reach out and claim her despite the town's judgment. But the moment passed. He looked at her the way one looks at a stranger, perhaps even a burden. Then he turned away. The blow landed heavier than any insult whispered in the street. Clara felt the world tilt. She had counted on him, even after every cruel word, every door slammed, every cold dismissal. Some foolish hope had clung to her ribs that he, at least, might soften. But Ash Hollow had taken his loyalty, just as it had taken everything else from her. Her breath came quick, but she forced her steps onward, past the saloon doors, past the bank with its shuttered windows, until the road bled into the stretch of open land that led out beyond town. The horizon rippled with heat, though the air was chilled. Prairie grass bent beneath the weight of the wind, and the sky stretched endless and merciless above. Clara paused at the edge of it, staring out at a wilderness that seemed to swallow sound and thought alike. Behind her, laughter rose, the careless kind meant to cut. She did not turn back. She had no tears left to give this town, no voice to defend herself against what it had already decided she was. She had been cast aside before. But here, in this place of dust and blood and silent cruelty, rejection bit deeper. Her father's silence was a verdict harsher than any shouted word. The wind whipped her hair loose from its pins. She pressed it back with a trembling hand, the shawl slipping from her shoulder. For a moment she felt exposed, small against the immensity of the land. Yet beneath the ache of humiliation, something stubborn stirred. The same grit that had carried her across miles of rail, wagon, and weary footfall now pressed against her ribs, whispering that she could not yield, not here, not yet. Still, questions clawed at her. Where could she go? Ash Hollow had been her last card, her last fragile chance to find footing. Now, even that had crumbled. She turned her face toward the wilderness, but every mile ahead promised hardship. Hunger gnawed at her already, and the cold of night would strip the strength from her bones. She might last 2 days, perhaps 3, before the land claimed her as it had claimed so many. Then, through the howl of the wind, a sound cut sharp and sudden. A rifle cocked. The metallic click cracked against the silence. Clara froze. Her heart slammed in her chest, breath halting. She turned her head slowly, the way instinct demanded, though fear begged her not to. At the far edge of the street, a man stood. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a weather-worn coat, hat brim pulled low against the sun. His face was shadowed, but she saw the glint of steel at his side, the dark line of the rifle in his hand. The stance was not hostile, not yet, but neither was it friendly. Men like him moved with a wariness carved from years of mistrust. Around them, the town had gone still. The children no longer laughed. Even the men in the general store leaned forward, their whispers dead on their lips. Clara felt the weight of all eyes, but for once it was not her shame they measured. It was the figure at the street's edge, a stranger who carried danger in his silence. Her breath came shallow. She knew the West had little mercy for women alone, especially women scorned. Men saw opportunity where society had cast ruin. Yet something in the way he held himself, something in the steadiness of his rifle, struck her as different. Not a predator's hunger, not a vigilante's rage, something else. The wind shifted, carrying dust between them. He lowered the rifle a fraction, enough to show he would not fire, yet. His voice carried, low and rough. "You shouldn't be standing alone out here." The words were not accusation nor mockery, but they landed heavy. Clara swallowed hard, unable to answer. For so long, every word spoken to her had carried judgment, cruelty, or silence. To hear something else, something almost steady, unsettled her more than the sound of the rifle itself. The man's gaze lingered, unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Then, without waiting for reply, he turned and walked toward the far edge of town, boots striking hard against the packed dirt. The townsfolk parted silently as he passed, their expressions wary, uncertain. Clara watched him go, her heart still racing. She did not know his name. She did not know why he had spoken to her, or why he had lowered the rifle when he might have raised it higher. All she knew was that in a town where every glance cut her to the bone, a stranger's voice had reached her without scorn. It was not salvation. It was not forgiveness. But it was a spark in the darkness. And as the sun slipped lower, bleeding gold across the prairie sky, Clara felt that spark press against the heavy weight in her chest. She did not trust it. Not yet. But she could not deny that it was there. Night fell fast over Ash Hollow, the kind of night that swallowed sound and spread shadows wide across the plain. The lamps in the saloon flickered dim, throwing slats of yellow light through swinging doors. Clara sat alone on the edge of town, perched on a weathered fence rail, her shawl drawn tight. The cold had deepened sharp against her skin, but she welcomed it. It kept her awake, kept her from sinking too far into despair. Behind her, the town carried on with its uneasy rhythm. Boots on wood, laughter edged with cruelty, the bark of dogs. But she knew none of those sounds held a place for her. She thought of the man she had seen at dusk, the stranger with the rifle. His voice lingered in her memory, quiet yet cutting through the silence that otherwise pressed against her. Why had he spoken at all? Men rarely risked attention by acknowledging someone already cast out. Yet he had. A warning, perhaps, or something else. She turned her face toward the horizon, where darkness had buried the last trace of the sun. Somewhere out there he had gone, disappearing into the wilderness. A crunch of footsteps in the dirt startled her. Clara rose quickly, her heart pounding. Out from the dark came the same man, hat brim low, his coat catching the faint light of the saloon behind him. He moved with the weary certainty of someone used to long miles and little rest. In his hand, the rifle hung easy, as though it belonged to him as much as his shadow. "You're still here," he said, voice low. "I thought you'd be gone." Clara tightened the shawl about her shoulders. "And go where?" The words escaped sharper than she intended. Her voice carried both defiance and exhaustion. He studied her a long moment, then looked toward the open plain. Not much out there tonight, but wolves and cold. Neither'll spare you. She bristled, though his words rang true. I've faced worse. Maybe, he said, but worse won't wait long to find you. The silence stretched. For the first time, Clara noticed the lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint scar beneath his jaw, the way his gaze held steady without cruelty. He was not young nor old, but worn in a way the West carved into a man's bones. He shifted, resting the rifle against the fence rail beside her. My name's Elias, he said simply. Clara hesitated. Names carried weight, opened doors, or shut them. But there was no one here to defend her reputation, no family to hide behind. Clara, she answered at last. The sound of it seemed to settle between them, fragile as glass. Elias nodded, as though committing it to memory. Clara, then, you should eat. He reached into the satchel slung across his shoulder and pulled out a strip of dried venison. He offered it to her without ceremony, without pity. Her pride told her to refuse, but her hunger betrayed her. She took it with trembling fingers, whispering, "Thank you." They ate in silence, the wind carrying the sharp cry of coyotes across the prairie. Each sound beyond town reminded her of the danger pressing in. Yet the presence of this man, this stranger, was enough to steady her trembling hands. At length, Elias spoke again. You've no place here, do you? The question cut deep, though his tone was not unkind. Clara swallowed hard. Not anymore. Then come, he said, rising. I won't leave a woman to freeze while the town looks the other way. Her breath caught. To follow him meant risk. Men who offered help often demanded more in return, and the frontier held countless stories of women who vanished into the hands of those they trusted least. But there was no guile in his voice, no smirk, no shadow of intention beyond the words themselves. He looked at her as though expecting refusal. Where'd we go? She asked cautiously. North, he said. The rivers are high, but there's shelter in the pines. Game runs thick there, and no one will trouble you. No one. The thought stirred something close to hope, though she smothered it quickly. Clara searched his face for deception, but all she found was the steady patience of a man used to being doubted. Finally, she nodded. They left Ash Hollow before dawn. The sky stretched pale and gray, the land brittle beneath frost. Clara followed close as Elias led them past the last farmsteads, beyond the reach of smoke and hearth light, into the raw wilderness. Each step carried the weight of finality. She did not look back. The journey was merciless. The wind cut sharp, the ground uneven. Clara's boots, worn thin from travel, offered little protection, and more than once she stumbled, catching herself against Elias's arm. He said nothing, only slowed his pace until she steadied. By midday, they reached the banks of a swollen river. The current roared, churning white against black stone. Elias studied it jaw tight. We cross here. Clara's eyes widened. It's madness. We'll be swept under. Maybe, he said, but the trail behind us won't stay empty for long. The words chilled her more than the wind. She turned, scanning the horizon, and her stomach knotted. Distant figures moved against the land, riders, the very men who had jeered her days before, now spurred by something darker than gossip. Elias gripped her arm. Trust me. Together, they waded into the torrent, water clawed at her legs, icy and merciless, dragging at her skirts. She gasped as it rose to her waist, nearly tearing her from her footing. Elias held her steady, his grip iron, his voice sharp. One step at a time. Don't fight the current. Lean with it. She obeyed, teeth chattering, heart hammering. Each step felt certain to be her last, but slowly, agonizingly, they reached the far bank. Elias hauled her onto the stones, both of them breathless, soaked through, but alive. From across the river came a shout. The riders had reached the bank they had abandoned. Clara watched, fear clawing at her chest. The men cursed, their horses balking at the water. One raised his rifle, but the distance was too great. For now, they were safe. Clara collapsed onto the grass, shivering. Elias crouched beside her, his face unreadable. "You did well." She met his gaze, searching for mockery, but found none. Only truth, only quiet respect. As night fell again, they made camp beneath the pines. Elias built a fire, sparks scattering into the darkness. Clara sat close, her shawl steaming from a heat, her body still trembling. For the first time in weeks, warmth seeped into her bones. She glanced at Elias, his face half lit by flame. He said little, his eyes always scanning the trees, but there was a steadiness in him that unsettled her in a way far different from fear. She had been cast out, shamed, stripped of everything. Yet here, in the wilderness, a stranger had stood beside her when no one else dared. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, wolves, hunger, or the riders who still pursued them. But as she sat in the glow of the fire, listening to the steady rhythm of Elias sharpening his knife, she felt something she had thought lost forever. Not safety, not yet, but the faintest whisper of belonging. Dawn came slow and gray through the pine boughs, the kind of light that softened nothing, that only revealed how cold the earth remained. Clara stirred from uneasy sleep, her shawl damp with dew, her limbs aching from the hard ground. Across the dying embers of the fire, Elias crouched with his rifle balanced on his knees, eyes scanning the treeline. He had not slept. She could see it in the hollows beneath his eyes, in the tautness of his shoulders. Yet he looked steady, as if the night's vigilance was a burden he was built to bear. She pushed herself upright, brushing pine needles from her skirts. "They'll still be hunting," she murmured. Elias gave a single nod. "They won't give up. Men like that never do. To them, you're a mark, something to chase until pride is satisfied." Clara swallowed against the weight of his words. The memory of those riders across the river still burned bright in her mind, the curses, the rifles, the cruel intent in their voices. She had been hunted before, by whispers, by the sharp edge of her father's silence. But never like this, never with blood promised in pursuit. They broke camp swiftly, smothering the coals, shouldering what little Elias carried. Clara followed him deeper into the timber, every step uphill, every breath sharp with the resin scent of pine. The forest muffled sound. But now, and then she caught the crack of a branch, the distant cry of a crow, each one twisting her gut with fear that the riders were closer than they seemed. By midday, they crested a ridge, the land falling away into a narrow valley. Elias paused, scanning the distance. "We'll rest here, but not long." Clara sank against a boulder, her legs trembling. "How far until we're safe?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes lingered on the horizon, where sky pressed hard against earth. Safe is a word this country doesn't know. But farther we go, harder they'll find us. She studied him as he spoke, the way his voice carried not just caution but memory. Elias bore scars deeper than the thin line on his jaw. There was a man shaped by exile, by the same rejection she carried in her bones. Perhaps that was why he had not turned from her when all others had. The crack of a rifle shattered the air. Clara cried out, throwing herself flat. Bark splintered from a tree inches above her. Elias moved fast, shoving her behind the boulder, his rifle raised in answer. "Stay low," he barked. Hooves thundered in the valley below. The riders had found them. 6 men, rifles glinting, horses lathered with sweat. Their leader, a broad-shouldered brute with a red scarf knotted at his throat, raised his pistol high, voice booming. "Hand her over, stranger, and maybe we let you walk?" Clara's blood turned to ice. Elias stood firm, eyes narrowed. "She's not yours to take." The leader laughed, harsh and cruel. "She ain't yours either. Don't be a fool." But Elias did not move, his stance unyielding. The first shot rang out, echoing through the valley. Elias fired back, the crack of his rifle snapping like thunder. A rider toppled from his saddle, horse screaming as it bolted. Chaos broke loose, gunfire, shouts, hooves tearing ground. Clara pressed against the rock, heart pounding so hard she thought her chest would split. She wanted to close her eyes, to shut it all out, but the sound of Elias's voice cut through the panic. "Clara, run to the trees! Now!" Her body obeyed before her mind could argue. She scrambled through brush, branches clawing her skin, lungs burning. Behind her, the fight raged. Bullets whined past, men cursed, horses reared. Then came a sound that froze her blood. Elias's grunt, low and pained. She spun back. He staggered, hand pressed to his side where blood darkened his coat. Yet he did not fall. He fired again, felling another rider, then turned his gaze toward her. Even across the chaos, his eyes found hers, steady as the first moment she'd seen him. Something fierce ignited in Clara's chest. Fear no longer held her. She seized a fallen branch, thick and heavy, and as one of the riders broke from the fray to charge her, she swung with every ounce of strength she possessed. The branch cracked against his head, sending him tumbling from the saddle. She gasped at the violence of it, at the weight of blood on her hands, but there was no time to falter. Elias reached her side, staggering but still upright. "Good," he rasped, voice strained with pain. "Don't stop fighting." Together they retreated into the trees, gunfire snapping at their heels. The riders pressed close, relentless. Branches tore at them. Roots threatened to trip them. But the forest grew thicker, the path narrower. The horses faltered, unable to follow at full speed. Elias leaned hard against Clara, his breath ragged. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing, hemmed in by rocks and trees. Elias dropped to one knee, blood soaking his coat. Clara knelt beside him, panic clawing at her throat. "You're bleeding too much. We can't." He gripped her wrist, fierce despite his weakness. "Listen, they'll come through that pass. We hold here. No running now." Her heart hammered. "We? Elias, you can barely stand." "Then you stand for both of us." His eyes burned into hers, steady, unyielding. "Clara, you've more strength than you know. Don't let them take it from you." The riders burst into the clearing. 5 left, guns raised, eyes hungry with violence. Clara rose, trembling, but with fire burning through the fear. She seized Elias's rifle, the weight foreign yet right in her hands. The men sneered, laughter sharp and cruel. "Look at that," the leader jeered. "Little bird thinks she's a hawk." Clara's voice rang clear. "Come closer and find out." The first rider spurred forward. Clara fired. The recoil slammed her shoulder, but the shot struck true. The man toppled from his saddle, his scream silenced by the earth. Shock rippled through the others, but she did not falter. Elias, though weak, lifted his revolver, adding his fire to hers. The clearing erupted in violence. Smoke choked the air, horses reared, bullets shattered stone. Clara fired again, then again, each shot guided not by skill, but by sheer will. When her rifle clicked empty, she grabbed Elias's knife, her body alive with terror and fury. One rider leapt from his horse to seize her, but she slashed wildly, steel catching flesh, forcing him back with a howl. When silence finally fell, only the moan of wind through the pines remained. 3 men lay still. 2 fled, spurring their horses into the trees, curses trailing behind them. The clearing reeked of powder and blood. Clara's chest heaved, her hands shaking, but she remained on her feet, the knife slick in her grip. Elias sagged against the rocks, his face pale, but his eyes shone with pride. "You stood," he whispered. Clara knelt beside him, tears burning hot against her cheeks. "Because you showed me how." He smiled faintly, though pain lined every breath. "No, because it was always in you." She pressed her shawl against his wound, desperate to staunch the flow. Above them, the sky had cleared, sunlight breaking through the pines. Clara felt its warmth on her face, felt the trembling in her limbs ease into something steadier. She had been hunted, rejected, abandoned, but she had not broken. And as Elias's hand found hers, firm despite his weakness, she knew she was no longer alone.